When the cameras weren't rolling, and in a secret short moment, Jan had said to the group of us working on the installation, and I quote, "We spend most of our lives, the bits that aren't work or sleep that is, that aren't liminal, while we spend most of our lives in these places, spaces, moments, these areas and sites of social happenings, the bits of our lives that are the really real bits, are spent in these goddamn places. And that's what's important. If the police or the Tories or the bigwigs come and shut me down tomorrow, that's what's important, really. I talk a lot of shit, but these moments will have always happened and they'll happen again, because we move, and we'll move, we'll always move, and we'll take them with us and make more of them. You are, therefore I am, you know? I only exist because of you being here, and I tell you what, there's a fucking lot of yous in here right now." Since moving to London, I became involved with a variety of spaces based on my interests in grassroots activism, community, radical education and cultural engagement. My belief in these areas as tools that could work towards consciousness raising on a large scale, as well as issue-specific resistance to oppressive class dynamics in the urban environment, led me to volunteering and project work within a series of liminal, threatened, precarious and persistent spaces formulated around these values: rave venues, community pubs, extracurricular classrooms, community libraries, meanwhile setups. Each space seemed to engage in an ongoing practice of resistance against dominant forms of commercialization, in fringe kinship models, in community engagement and politicization in some form, grassroots activation, and though each had different challenges to the execution of these values, different paradigmatic legacies to their context, I was interested in the complex web of solidarities that these spaces shared, how their part in a shared resistance struggle could be highlighted, strengthened, further activated, explored. There was MOT, a rave, exhibition and gig space organised as a fringe underground venue. It had grown out of cheap live-in studio projects intended to develop artist communities, and eventually dipped its foot into parties, illegal parties, and then the commercial world of licensing when threatened with repeat moves and shutdowns by police. The organisers seek ways to facilitate community and uncommercialised artistic and cultural growth whilst operating in an increasingly precarious and financialised market that affects their survival as well as their audience, and the eventuality of moving sight looms constantly over the space. New Cross Library, a community volunteer organised library that was occupied and acquired by local activists in the wake of mass public cuts to library services in the first years of austerity. The space has become a fluidly changing asset, offering cultural, civic, educational and social resources depending on the time or need or person. It stands opposite the publicly sold former Deptford Town Hall. It emphasised an outsourcing of civic and communal labour to the volunteers willing to pick up the slack after the rollback of the state. Other spaces included the extracurricular classroom resources of Lister Community School, former public classrooms that had all but become consumed by the conversion of the former state school into a glistening academy, which corporatised the space and subsumed them within the trust model of marketised schooling, where once before they had been spaces that residents would use for clubs. The now heavily policed sites offer little public access, and the clubs run by the schools are tied to strict curriculum values. And I also engaged with the Montague Arms Restoration Society's mission to turn the run-down and historic pub into a community asset through their public and policy-based campaigns, as well as with the Sister Midnight Group, who curated a hugely successful campaign that led almost to the community seizure of the Ravensbourne Arms. In each case, they were volunteerist and community-focused approaches to working within the big society model of austerity localism to gain assets, and seemed engaged in a similar contextual approach to the other sites, utilising the strength of a shared resistance struggle against the erasure of community spaces. I was fascinated by their linkages and the shared conditions of their existences, struggles and empowering potentials. After volunteering in these spaces and with these groups and becoming engaged in their day-to-day projects, I began this exploration into their shared political position by learning of their histories and stories, charting these onto a growing timeline an archive of space commercialisation in the UK, and space erasure. As I developed this timeline, certain historical aspects seemed key to the developments of their shared conditions, and in this film I hope to first demonstrate the historical research and contextual web that was developed as a means to situate these spaces in a concretised resistance struggle, as well as document some of the project responses we enacted. The first key theme seemed to be the historical idea of the commons. This is what arose for me when I was looking, anyway, for some sort of contextual approach. These were protected and shared public assets and places that were common and accessible to all in the early history of Britain. This appeared to be the active tradition these spaces shared in, evoking the formerly public, accessible, social, civic, cultural and educational commons that made up the folk environments of the UK. However, the commons have ceased to exist in the way that they used to when they were written into formal constitution almost 800 years ago, around the formation of modern England with the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, and were for the most part enclosed and sold off by the bourgeois as modern capitalism began to concretise, as property rights and the accumulation of land became key aspects towards power and profit generation. This erasure that has systematically increased as the ideological domination of modern capitalism grew has all but eroded the commons. There was a short spike of UK public asset generation around the middle of the 20th century when post-war interventionist Keynesianism grew in influence, leading to the creation of the welfare state as well as the growth of council house stock and other such social resource creation. But this all came crashing down in another series of enclosures and privatizations on an unprecedented scale after the rise of Thatcherism in the UK. Thatcherism was one of the political concretizations of the school of neoliberalism, an ultra-capitalist turn towards market-dominated value systems that was steadily formulated in opposition to leftist economics in the early mid-20th century, growing in bourgeois thought through the formation of think tanks until it reached power through the policies of Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the US, as well as with other leaders around the world after Western globalist trade policies spread the ideas worldwide. David Harvey, a leading Marxist conceptualizer of the neoliberal turn, theorizes neoliberalism as a broad realignment of power by the updated capitalist class, namely business owners and corporate actors, who foresaw the finance and the free market could be used to prolong colonial power dynamics, inflate economies, and sustain the hegemonic world order of the 1%. Numerous events in the 20th century had shaken the old models of capitalism. The exploitation of the resource-producing colonies was rocked by a mass series of nationalizations and costly new logistical systems, which led to oil crises and cold wars. Growing leftist sentiment in the West as well as the East threatened their ideological underpinnings and dominance. So just as Walter Rodney noted in his seminal book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa that the primitive accumulation of slavery was only abolished when it became too costly for the bourgeois, in effect driving down the domestic labour wage of white workers and leading to mass slave results, and replaced then with unequal property rights that enforced indentured labour, again through the price of rents as opposed to more obvious shackles. The neoliberals became aware that they would have to adopt a modern power shift of their own to keep the colonies and working class in check, to shift power away from the resource production centres of the newly independent colonies. They would have to financialise the Western world, drop the backing of the economy with gold and material, and instead become the credit hubs of the new order. Only then could they install the new hegemony of GDP and quell the left threat through an extreme revalorisation of the global framework. They started by doling out massive loans to newly independent countries through the World Bank that would have to be paid back at humongous interest rates, keeping them forever in debt, and therefore maintaining colonial dynamics and trade exploitation. This held back the international threat abroad, and then they began to privatise and sell off commons and assets within their own countries, stifling union power, fragmenting and breaking up the collective commons bloc that leftists had been using to cede power away from the neoliberals and the capitalists, turning the working class into individual consumers without public resources, acting out of their own self-interest then in the new financialised and conceptually limitless financial economy. focusing in on just the right to buy schemes, which allowed council house occupants to buy their publicly owned council properties after a certain amount of time. We can already see an ideological power move in play that split and fragmented the English working class down the middle for the new millennium. On one side, the homeless, renting, precariat class of the 20th century, kept forever in check and out of assets, and on the other, the next generation of small-time landlords, revalorized into self-interested individualists engaging in the free market network of atomization. This surge in privatizations and public sell-offs enabled a mass wave of new enclosures, from the selling of land, buildings and council houses to the railways, energy services and water providers. The Commons now accounted for much less than 3% of the UK. By the time the economic crash signalled an abrupt failure in the dream of trickle-down economics in 2008, the automated processes instilled in the last 2.5 decades of policy had already entrenched themselves, and the 1% were firmly unopposed ideologically and structurally. The crash was utilised to further ideological gains, bringing in sweeping austerity measures instead of intervention and reinvestment in publicly owned assets. The shock doctrine of neoliberalism seized on the crash to increase its accumulation by dispossession, and another wave of privatizations and public sell-offs occurred to move money into the private sector, as councils and local services were cut and further financialised. In our own time, the great NHS is currently threatened by increasing managed decline and privatisation narratives. It was this erasure of the Commons and the Commons as a resistance struggle narrative that led theorists like Mara Ferrari to state, in order to exist in our current system, the Commons have had to become a verb, a continual and ongoing practice that shifts between spaces and activities and groups, no longer explicitly tied to the spaces that now stand erased and threatened. Commoning practices must be capable of growing bulbs all over the urban environment, whenever the practice can rear itself and be activated. This seemed to be the key practice shared by the spaces I engaged with, an engagement with precarious temporalities, but with the insistence that simply, we move. MOT founder Jan Mohammed knew that every rave site had an intrinsic short-term lifespan, but lessons would be learned and new spaces would be found, created, chipped away, growing off and on top of what came before. The New Cross Library always considered themselves, quote, a stopgap until the libraries were taken back in-house by a new interventionist, socialist-inclined Labour government. But now they strategise about occupations and other sites, spaces, if they were threatened with enclosure or burnout. This is the Midnight Project that so valiantly almost transformed the Ravensbourne Arms into the third community pub in London, immediately started looking for another space upon failure. And if their new project falls through, they will look for other potential sites. They are already twinned with the council to find a place with a peppercorn rent that they can renovate for community use. This is what Mara Ferrari calls then the permanence of temporary urbanism, a permanence indemnified by its flux, its adaptable nature, and its calling out to a higher solidarity of an ongoing resistance struggle narrative. This engagement with fluid temporality, fluid spaces, missions, not assets, or at least physical assets, seemed tied to the legacy of resistance struggles that never collapse history within themselves and are always contextualized, situated, ongoing, persisting, moving, building, built here not on the dogma of property rights that constitutes being for the neoliberal, as John Locke put it, but instead on the ontology of activity that constitutes being for the survivor, the builder, the opposer, the creator. These conditions of commoning are even further tested and illuminated following the UK's decade of post-crash austerity. As local budgets were cut and assets were sold, stripped and reformulated for the private sector, strategies of intense managed decline and ideological terraforming were enabled to further erase conditions of commoning. For these commoning practices, which put people together and in turn radicalise communities against the no society individualist greed, are by their nature in opposition and threatening to the self-interested, atomised consumer models of neoliberalism. They generate solidarity and threaten the dominant value systems through group strategy and engagement with the kind of consciousness-raising activities that radicalized a generation of anti-capitalists in the mid-20th century. In this way, then, localism in the grassroots was itself attacked under austerity, not just by cuts, but by systemic changes to the way such areas would be perceived by UK policy. It's obvious, then, that they were trying to quell what posed a great threat to the dominance of neoliberalism as something that needed people as atomized, individualized actors. The Localism Act of 2011, for example, which followed the conservative Big Society manifesto, which attempted a restructure of the grassroots to pick communities as corporate actors, to roll back the state and have volunteerism lead our local councils and residential spaces. They introduced community share models and volunteer-centred opportunism. These acts outsourced the labour for commons to communities and rolled back state funding, and were paralleled with a huge series of local authority cuts and resource gutting, in turn enabling the growth of food banks and engendering commoning activities within even further financialised and entrepreneurial frameworks. Commoning spaces could be saved, but only if they entered into the market on the market's term, if only they could prove their immediate financial legitimacy, an actual line from community asset forms and terms. This was clearly a cultural revalorisation in the same manner of the new enclosures of the 80s. This state rollback to make way for the market is the key neoliberal tenet, which has of course had a huge cultural effect on our values and life worlds. The New Cross Library was encouraged by the council precisely because with a volunteer library they could hit community outreach quotas whilst not having to pay for any staff or further resources, as was the story for many libraries across the country, which weren't just cut and erased, but also were gutted, hollowed out, pressurised to become volunteer-run, or turned into things only open a few days a week with very limited resources on offer. Waves of educational reform follow in a similar suit. Academies, the key educational transformation in the UK under austerity, going from just a few academies in 2007 to over 85% of secondary schools at the end of 2020. These academies cut out the local authority influence over funding and policy, close the gap between central government, who's the funder, and the school. The schools then must become competitive to earn their funding and earn their place on league tables through market tactics, otherwise they'll get snapped up by the school star-bucking trusts, which are homogenising schools the country over. At Lister Community School, whose extracurricular centre I worked with, this has led to stricter policing methods within schools and more regimented use of space. The schools were being eked out of their commoning potentials and were restructured towards heavenly vocational curriculums meant to ready children for the precarious labour market. I began to create projects in these spaces that situated each of them within these resistant struggle narratives. I wanted to help embolden and link them through work that illuminated these solidarities. In MOT, I began a series of politically themed events and a reading group for this very subject matter. In New Cross Learning, I ran courses, workshops and a film group that dealt with these issues, as well as helped with the digital literacy courses. At Lister's extracurricular space, I held creative and disruptive clubs that demonstrated how the school had changed as it became more marketised, and enacted free-form use of school space so that children could understand that the school spaces was theirs to occupy. And with the community pub groups, I engaged in door-knocking sessions that worked towards space imagining workshops and recollection of lost spaces, memories from the pubs lost, and hopeful potential for the community pubs that could come through hard work and organisation. This helped me build a better timeline and archive, informed by the global and national and macro context, as well as with the emotional and ephemeral and experiential, as well as temporal, of course. These workshops led to a series of what Jan termed with me monument installations. Monuments to moments, that is. He found this wordplay funny. In MOT, New Cross Learning and at Lister, I created large-scale installations of paper. This paper was reminiscent of the materials we had been using in workshops to sketch, brainstorm, timeline, recollect and imagine. And I blew up our timelines massively for all visitors to see and examine. Over all the walls and display areas of spaces. In MOT we covered the entirety of the unit in paper. In Lister, the entirety of the worktop spaces, which I'm not allowed to show here, as we were not actually allowed to film what those installation workshops. The school didn't give me permission to show this film. In New Cross Library, I used their display board to create a timeline of the library's origin and what they'd been offering over the 10 years of their existence. In each case, I invited the organisers as well as punters and attendees to events to add memories and date entries and quotes, and these were built up from storytelling exercises and former workshop timelines and other things that I had done in the space and done with the organisers. This enabled us to become intensely spatially aware of the spaces we were inhabiting and how the space worked as a conduit for time and these moments and these activities that we were holding. In doing all this, we built up monuments to moments of time, to situated and contextualized time, to the influx spaces of commoning that have adapted for this new century. And once we had built up these installations into huge testaments to the realities and happenings and politics of their existences, me and the organisers and other attendees took one last look over them and then ripped them all down, tore at them and turned all the paper and memories and writings and sketches to rubble. You're currently probably sitting in a small little space which is made up from all that detritus of memory, the lived-in and embodied timelines, the precarious spaces that move from one moment of time to the next in a matter of time. Despite the hardships and complexities, these aspects will always continue and raise space for even more transformative potentials, of deeper and more expansive consciousness raising, of more radical collective collaboration and organisation. Even now, MOT faces another shutdown threat, and the New Cross Learning Library readies itself to become a warm bank to help with the cost of living crisis for the precariat that is growing within the UK population. These spaces move, and in doing so, offer us models for resistance, models for remembering resistance, models for continuing resistance, models for illustrating the years and years of resistance that will go on and on and on and must go on.